Well, hi, once again, it is Mike Hingson, your host for Unstoppable Mindset. Today we get to interview Vicki de Klerk-Rubin, although I've been calling her Vicki de Klerk. She is the director of the Validation Institute, and I'm not going to say more about that because that's really kind of her job along with everything else that she gets to do. I met Vicki, a little over a month ago, and she went to spend time with children in Rhode Island, although she's over in the Netherlands. So, Vicki, you haven't had mostly to put up with all of our crazy weather out here in California or as much of the crazy weather that the East has had, have you?
No, we've had our own crazy weather here in the Netherlands.
There you go. Well, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We are glad to have you here.
And I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So what kind of crazy weather?
Very, very cold and then very, very warm and tons of rain, which I suppose is fairly normal for the Netherlands at this time of year, which is why we have such beautiful flowers here.
Well, as long as the dikes continue to hold or somebody has a finger to put in the dikes, then we're okay.
Yes, we are all fine. You know, the Dutch send water experts around the world to help people deal with flooding.
And I've heard stories of that. I don't know a lot about it, although I've heard a couple of stories of ways that they have helped. I think there was something on 60 Minutes here a few years ago about some of the things that the Dutch had been doing to help with some of the flooding somewhere. And of course, it's a whole fascinating process to deal with all that. And out here, we have just had so much rain and snow in California. There are places here in California up in the Sierras where we've already had over 670 inches of snow just this year.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's like over 55 feet of snow. It's crazy. And we got a little bit more snow this week.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, we're moving right into springtime here. All the daffodils are up and tulips are, you know, just everywhere, every color. It's quite spectacular.
Wow. Well, that is
a cool. Nice time of year to be here.
I'm jealous, I think. It was 40 degrees Fahrenheit this morning for a low. No, I'm sorry. It was 34 degrees Fahrenheit for a low. And now we're all the way up to 44.
Spring is a-coming. Spring is a-coming.
Eventually. Well, tell me a little bit about you, maybe sort of your early history and a younger Vicki and all that, and how you kind of got to where you are and some of those things.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I was born in New York City, and I'll skip all the early youth stuff and jump straight to university. My first university was Boston University, where I got a Bachelor of Fine Arts. And then I went off to New York City to work in theater, off-Broadway and Broadway theater, and on the administrative side. And then I did an MBA at night school because I felt I needed that. And then I met this handsome Dutch guy. And in 1986, I just dropped everything, my career, my apartment, packed my bags and my everything, and moved to Amsterdam. And I've been overseas since then, really. We got married. We have 2 children. He is just finishing up his job as a diplomat for the Dutch State Department. And so we've moved around quite a bit, all over the place. Vienna twice, Jordan, in the Middle East. We even had a posting to the wilds of New York City, which was quite... it was strange, I have to tell you, going back after so many years abroad, and it felt like a posting. So, and that now we're here in The Hague, and that feels very comfortable. And work-wise, as a young mother, I was doing all sorts of different volunteer stuff. And then my mother, who is Naomi Feil, and she founded the validation method, which is a way of communicating with very old people, or even not so old people, people who have some form of cognitive decline. And she developed this method in the 60s and the 70s, and then wrote about it in 1982, started the Validation Training Institute in 1982. And I guess it was 1989. I was living in Vienna. I had two small children, and she said, "Can you help me revise my book? It's a little disorganized." And I said, "Sure." That was a nice activity for me. So I got all her reference material, went through the book, revised it, put in all the citations and the footnotes. And at the end of that process, it felt to me like I really understood the validation method. And I was asked to speak in some nursing home. And I said, "Sure, I can talk about the validation method." So I went in, and at the end of my little hour song and dance, there was a very experienced nurse sitting in the front. And she had her arms crossed on her chest and leaned back and gave me this look. And she said, "Well, that's all very nice and good, but what do you do when Mr. Smith spits at you?" And I had to stop because I didn't know. And I went running back to the book and realized I really knew nothing. I had no practical experience. It was all book knowledge. Mm-hmm. And validation is a practical method that was developed through trial and error and my mom's practice in working with older adults in a nursing home. So what I did was I started volunteering at a nursing home and building up my practice. And then I went back to school and became a registered nurse to give myself some background, and I felt more secure with that knowledge. And in 2014, when my mom was, she was reaching 85 at that point, and she really didn't, 80, I guess, at that point. She didn't want to keep doing the job of executive director. And I had been taking bits and pieces of it from her to lighten her load over a decade. So it was at that point that I became the executive director of the Validation Training Institute. And since that time, I've been, you'll appreciate this. I'm trying to professionalize it to the extent that I can retire. So that means building up enough of a financial position and marketing and all that business stuff so that I can be free to do the fun stuff like teach or build curricula, things that I really love to do.
Yeah, that's always the way of it, that all too often the business side of something gets in the way of doing what we really want to do, which is, as you said, to do the fun stuff, to really have an active role in helping people, even though the business part of it is really something that's necessary and active. But it is kind of important, I think, for most of us to want to get to the real nitty-gritty of doing some of the stuff rather than just doing the business part of it. I understand that feeling well.
Yeah, we're getting there slowly but surely.
Well, so tell me a little bit about the validation method, what it is, what are some of its basic principles, And then I'm also curious to find out if Mr. Smith or any of his colleagues ever did spit at you, but that's another question.
I have never been spit at, actually. I've never been bitten or hit. And I attribute that to the effectiveness of the validation method and also knowing my limits. The basic concepts of the validation method are: we acknowledge that all older adults with cognitive decline, well, really every human being on this planet is unique and worthwhile, and that we should not try to change them. It's very important to recognize that people who are living with cognitive decline, they are as they are. They can't fix it. And the more we try to change them, the more difficult the relationship becomes. So in validation, we go to their side of the street. That was one of the things my mom said all the time, that we have to cross the street to them. We can't expect them to come to us. So that means if an older adult who is missing being a mom, and her children are all grown up, but she really misses that identity piece. And so as a very old woman living in perhaps a memory care community, and she goes wandering through the halls at 3 o'clock saying, I have to go pick up the children now, that the validating caregiver doesn't say to this woman, now, Mrs. de Klerk, you know, your children are all grown now. That's reality orientation. And it does not speak to the basic human need of this woman, whose need is to have identity, to be a mom, to be a good mom. And so we don't lie and say, oh, you know what? Someone else is picking up the kids today. I will know that that's a lie, because this is another principle of validation. All, well, I don't want to use all or never or any of those extremes. Older adults who are living with cognitive decline on some level really know what the truth is. Mm-hmm. It's just that that truth does not help them in that moment. And so it's easier to go to a personal reality that does fulfill the needs of the moment. So what the validating caregiver would say in such a circumstance is, oh, what time did you always pick up your children? We don't lie and pretend. This is not an acting class. And the woman might say, oh, 3:30 they get out and I always am there. And then I might say, always, my goodness, what a great mom you were. Was there ever a time when you couldn't, when something happened? And then the old lady might say, well, there was this one time I got held up by so much traffic and I was late and the kids were panicked and it was a horrible thing. And then I can just be with her in that memory of that moment and say, oh, what a scary thing. And then she can let it go. She can express it. This is another important validation principle, that painful emotions, when they are expressed to somebody who's really listening, those feelings will lessen. But emotions that are pressed under and not expressed will get bigger. And that's basic Jung, actually.
Yeah, what's really going on is she's got or whoever has a memory, and the memory is, I always pick up the children at 3:30, and she doesn't know how to deal with the fact that she can't do that anymore, and probably on, as you said, on some level, for most people, they know the kids are grown, they know that they can't pick them up, but that's still where she is. And that's what I hear you saying, is that you have to approach them where they are and help them deal with that memory and move to the point of saying, yeah, it is a memory. And
they may never
totally get away from it.
Yeah. And that's okay. Our goal is not to change them, but to accept them the way they are.
Yeah.
Plus, it's a basic human need. Identity is a basic human need. Everyone has it, no matter whether you're oriented or disoriented or have a seeing impairment or a mobility impairment. Everybody's needs to be accepted the way they are.
And
right?
we just don't do that. We are so far away from accepting people where they are. And the problem is, we view people in ways like, oh, this person's impaired. They don't see, so they're impaired, or they don't hear, or whatever. And impaired is such a horrible concept, because the reality is people who see have their own impairment, and their biggest impairment is they're locked into seeing. And when something happens where that eyesight doesn't work for them, they don't know what to do with it. And I mention that because we invented the electric light bulb, which really takes away most of the challenges of not being able to see. But we don't collectively as a society recognize that disability still exists. And we haven't progressed to the point of recognizing that disability doesn't really mean lack of ability at all. And we oftentimes, it seems to me, try to get people pigeonholed into one of these things where in one way or another, they're not as good as we are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to get people out of that.
My mom says when cognition goes, intuition grows. And what you were just talking about reminded me of that statement. When we're so busy thinking and remembering and using our brain in that way, we often lose sight of intuition and our gut.
Yeah.
Whereas people who have lost some cognitive ability, it's easier for them to flow into something that can often be poetic. Yeah.
People are beautiful creatures, and every single person is a beautiful creature. And as I tell many people when we talk about coming on the podcast, everyone has a story to tell. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we hear more of these stories. Several years ago, I was approached by some people at the 9/11 Memorial Institute museum, because they're collecting oral histories of the events surrounding September 11th from the standpoint of people who were there. And I was in New York actually in 2020, and we did an interview, and actually ended up only being the first half of the interview. And the second half we just did yesterday. And it just made me realize all the more the importance of everyone telling their own stories and us being open enough to hear those, because it shows so much that we all can learn from listening to each other. And we just don't do nearly enough of that. So
I'm listening extremely carefully right now. And if you don't mind, a little, using that as a segue, listening and observing are two of the most important, I don't want to call it a technique, but it's certainly a prerequisite to validating.
Mm-hmm.
We have to really take in the other person with everything we have so that we can respond to not just the words, but what's underneath the words.
How do we teach people how to do that?
I spend a lot of time doing that, actually. I start by saying the first thing you need to do is to learn to center yourself. Clear away your thoughts and feelings. Create an open space within yourself so that you can take in another person. That's often the hardest part. Just getting people to stop and breathe. Then there's the observing and listening to the person you want to validate. And what do you see? And how do you feel? What can you feel when you take in that other person? And then there's calibrating, where you adjust yourself to match the other person. And that's a process of moving into empathy. I guess what we're talking about is, how do you break down and teach people how to have empathy?
Mm.
And by empathy and validation, we mean we go to the feelings of the other person. We don't judge it. We don't pretend or act it. We, for that moment, share the emotion that the other person is feeling. Yeah.
And what I hear you saying on one level is, you have to drop your own prejudices. You have to start really taking a major step back. And as you said, looking at people where they are, mm-hmm. and really turning yourself into a sponge or an open book, and start at the beginning with each person that you interact with.
The hardest validation I've ever had to do, I was working in an Austrian nursing home, and there was an ex-Nazi. And I come from a German Jewish family. So that was a kind of loaded situation. And I was thinking, how am I ever going to have empathy with this Nazi? Because he was very open about it, and still, you know, it's a shame that Hitler's gone. And when I went in there, I did a lot of centering exercise. I did a lot of observation. And then I moved in to find a space between us that was comfortable for him. You have to, as a validator, remove your own need for closeness or distance. You have to find that boundary of the other person's space. And when I shook his hand and said hello, he said something about his guys, his buddies. And I realized, aha, now I've got a connection point. Everybody wants to be part of a group. You don't want to be isolated and pushed out. So we had a marvelous talk, actually, about how important it is to have buddies and friends and people you can count on, because I feel that as well. So it's about finding those connections, those basic human needs that we all share. And then you can find empathy with almost anybody. And that's what we teach when we teach the validation method. And that's just the first part. Then there are techniques, verbal techniques to use when the client expresses themselves verbally. And there are nonverbal techniques that you can use when the person has stopped communicating verbally. And we can still communicate with somebody even when they're not communicating verbally.
Mm-hmm.
When they're pounding, for instance, or pacing, or just nom, 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 nom. You see that sometimes in memory care units. So we've got techniques where we can reach in, and we don't expect them to start talking. We don't expect people in wheelchairs to start walking. It's about connection and communicating on a very human, emotional level. And anybody can learn it. Anybody. I've taught geriatricians, doctors, nurses, nursing assistants, social workers, and just plain carers. Family members can work with this method. Home caregivers. Really, even the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker can use elements of the validation method just within the community.
You were talking about the individual who is a Nazi. Do people want to use the validation method to change someone? And I gather from what you're saying is that that's not what the purpose of it is. So I can just see people asking that question.
You would never, ever you can't use the validation method to change somebody.
Yeah.
It's not its purpose.
And that was my point. And I wanted to make sure that was really clear. It's about establishing empathy. It's about establishing, well, what some people might say is rapport, but it is all about empathy to be able to have a discussion. And it's the validation method isn't to change, it's to relate and establish a joint comfort zone, at least in part.
To connect with another human being, so that there's trust, and to communicate on whatever level the other person wants to communicate, whether verbally or non-verbally at that moment.
So when, let's say, you utilize the validation method to establish a connection and lines of communications with someone, who benefits?
Well, both of us do, actually. The older adult benefits because they can express what's on their heart or mind, and feel accepted. Self-worth goes up because I'm there not to judge. I'm just there to be with them wherever they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it fills me with joy. You know, to connect with another human being on a very deep level, for me, brings joy. And I think for many care partners, whether you're a professional or not professional, that's where you get your giggles, is making those connections and feeling like, I really helped somebody today.
And then you go back and you discover, it helped me too.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I think that's an extremely important part of it, because the whole issue of who benefits, everybody benefits. If you're able to communicate, we live in this world where it seems to be so hard to have conversations, so hard to communicate and establish connections. And when we really understand what establishing a good connection is and we do it, that's just great for everyone.
Agreed. And I'll also say, when I'll use the validation method, because that's, what we're talking about. When an entire institution, and whether you call it a nursing home or a memory care community, whatever the word is, when most of your people are working with validation, at least at a basic level, the entire feeling of the place changes. Suddenly, people are not rushing around. There's no screaming. There's just, it feels more like a home.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun. I've had the pleasure of being in several communities where validation was truly integrated from top to bottom. And it's totally different than when you walk into a different kind of organization. So administrators benefit, the receptionist behind the front desk benefits, as well as all the staff and the residents.
How widely accepted is the whole concept of utilizing the validation method today?
It's really up and down throughout the world. We have got training centers in 14 different countries. I would say, funny enough, in the United States, we are less well known than, say, in Germany, Austria, where it's actually taught in nursing school. It's part of what students get when they learn gerontology. It's certainly integrated into most training in France. But the US is big, and there are a lot of competitive methods out there. So we have to slowly get more and more recognition, and I think that's happening.
Is it also a situation where people tend to be more self-centered and they don't want to look beyond their own prejudices a lot? And I ask that question because I spoke with someone on the podcast several weeks ago, and we were talking about how disabilities are handled around the country, around the world. And one of the things that he said was that in many places it's pretty overt, or absolutely overt and upfront about how people feel about people with disabilities. And in the United States, we pay lip service to what's supposed to be the right thing, but when it really comes down to it, we still, in very subtle ways, haven't changed. And so I wonder if this is another one of those kinds of incidences where we're dealing with a lot of self-centeredness, and people don't want to allow their barriers, much less working with others and helping those to get their barriers to be broken down, to get back to really conversing and communicating.
Well, I had about 1 million thoughts as you were talking, so I'm not quite sure which one to start with. I live in the Netherlands. I happen to be disabled mobility-wise. I walk with crutches. So I can speak to this issue from that perspective. And I have to tell you, the United States in general is way ahead than most countries in Europe when it comes to disability access, at least for mobility issues. I think also sight and hearing, and that's because you have an incredible lobby that has been pushing through laws and making it required. And we don't have that here in the Netherlands. So it's harder here.
Yet.
May I continue one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
On the other hand, when I'm in the United States, it may be easy access onto buses and trams and all that stuff, but people have a tendency to be overly patronizing.
Solicitous and so on, yeah.
Yeah, I know they mean well, but it just feels overly, oh, please don't stand. Oh, you shouldn't climb the stairs. Oh, you shouldn't. Oh, take care. And here in the Netherlands, they don't even notice. They'll trip over my crutch, before they actually see it. So is that better? Is that, I don't know. Yeah,
it's hard to make a qualitative decision about that, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Ironically, here in the U.S., for example, it took, some people who happen to be blind wanted to take the LSAT to become lawyers. Right. And there were challenges because the organizations they were working with and the Bar Association wouldn't let them use their assistive technologies to be able to read the tests and so on. And it took going to the Supreme Court to get the Bar Association to be compelled to adhere to equal access. Really means equal access, not the way you define it, but you need to let people use what they're familiar with to be able to function and take the LSAT. And that was one of the things that flashed through my mind, which is why I asked the question, but you were going to say.
I think in the case of people who have cognitive issues, it's very easy for the rest of the world to put them down, put them off to the side. I mean, when you think of nursing homes in the old days, they were always outside of the cities, somewhere in the countryside where nobody had to see them. And people were patronized like crazy. People were, they were treated really badly and often locked up. Most memory care units are locked units, and that's just a prison. And the thinking behind that is, they don't know what's good for them. And that's very painful. In some places, a nursing home feels and looks and smells like a prison. And that's just not a way one should treat older adults. It's brutal, but that's changing. And I must say, I have to give honor to my mom because she was the one who fought for decades against this medicalization of aging, against trying to change them. I mean, she's the godmother of person-centered care. And when people really get it and do that, you can't lock the front door. You have to find other ways to provide safety or to really discuss how important is safety or self-determination. because it's usually those two things that are being weighed. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate it. It goes back to, all too often we think we're better than, or we think we have the answers,
Right.
and we don't know. We've never really taken the time to learn. We're sticking to our prejudices and our old ways of thinking, and so the result is that we think we know what we don't know.
Well, and maybe we do know. In
On some level.
cases, if an old lady leaves the facility and crosses the street and doesn't look, she can get hit by a bus. We know that. But locking her up takes away her self-determination. So what's more important, her life, or to be able to make choices? Health versus self-worth and identity and agency in your own life. And I don't have an answer for that.
No.
I think, every child should have that discussion with their parent as the parent gets older, and to say, all right, how do you want to deal with, I am worried about your health, or I am worried that you're going to fall, or, I don't think you should be driving, and I am frightened there's going to be an accident. And to have discussions about that, not just take the car keys.
That's the key, isn't it?
So to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some things that you could teach, or examples you could give for people who are listening to this now, of techniques that they can bring into their own lives and what they do?
Well, I'll give you the most important one of all, and that is centering. So if you would put your feet on the ground and sit in a somewhat relaxed position, and take in a breath through your nose and exhale through your mouth. And as you breathe in through your nose, feel where the breath expands in your torso. Follow that breath. And as you breathe, clear away your thoughts and feelings and just be with the breath. And take 2 or 3 extra breaths. And start to listen to the sounds around you. You can move your shoulders. If you had your eyes closed, you can come back and open your eyes. So that is a very short exercise, one of a dozen that we can use to find our center and get open. And I think that's the most important. Sometimes it's just taking the breath.
Mm-hmm.
If the listener already has a mindfulness practice or a meditative practice, great. Use that. If you do Tai Chi or one of the martial arts, I'm sure you're familiar with taking in that breath and clearing it out, because you have to be in that ready position. And when you go into communication with an older adult, you have to be in the ready position, not to fight, but to connect. And the second technique that I'll give you is super simple, and that is ask, don't tell. We try to, when the other person is verbal, meaning they can communicate with words, it's a great idea to ask open questions. Who, what, where, when, and how. And really try to avoid why. Because when somebody has cognitive decline, the why can be too difficult. And it's not the important thing, actually. The why is often our curiosity at play. Well, why did you do that? Why did he do that?
And that person may not even know.
Right. Right.
Or can't verbalize it.
Right. Or it's just not important. The why is not important to that person.
Yeah.
But, what happened and when or how many, or those are great questions to ask. So those are two techniques. And don't do the second without first doing the first.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that you center first and then.
And I would also submit that, well, both of those techniques, but especially the second, because the first is something that we should do, but the second also is something that we can do within ourselves. I have been a great advocate for a long time about taking time at the end of the day to look at our own life experiences that day. Mm-hmm. What worked? What didn't work? Why didn't it work? And what worked? Might there be ways that we could make it better? And something that I talk about, and I didn't used to do, I used to use the term when I talk about doing speeches, and I will always record them and then go back and listen to them. And I've said I'm my own worst critic. And I've learned that's a horrible thing to say, because it is such a negative concept, as opposed to saying I'm my own best teacher. And by listening, I can teach myself what to do better, but keep it in a positive sense. But again, at the end of the day, just look at everything and the things that didn't go well. Okay, what do I do so that that doesn't happen again? And teach myself something positive. It is something that we just don't do. We always say we don't have time. Oh, I'm too busy. I just can't do that. Well, yeah, you can. If it's going to make you 150% better, why wouldn't you want to do that?
Mm. Yeah. One of the things I'm working on these days is integrating a meditation into every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about deep, hour-long sitting cross-legged on the ground, because A, I cannot get onto the ground, and B, I don't have the time or the concentration, to be honest, to do it for more than, say, 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. But I am now giving myself the breath to sit somewhere in the middle of the day when I feel it's time for a transition. And sometimes it's 1 minute, sometimes it's 3 minutes, sometimes it's 15 minutes, just to get quiet. Mm-hmm. And it feels like a gift. Yeah.
It is so worth doing. Mm. And I am sure you would agree, you benefit so much from doing that.
Mm. Yeah. Yes, I do. For me, it's helpful when I feel scattered in my head and I've got too much to do and this and that. And it's like, okay, all right, drop it down to light speed, because when I am feeling scattered in my head, I waste time. When you can't focus, you can't work as efficiently or effectively. So if I can find that concentration again, then I work so much better. I cross everything off my list, and that feels excellent.
It goes back to recentering.
That's right.
So in addition to learning to be a little bit more meditative or learning to center yourself during the day, what other kinds of things are you working on now?
Well, the most exciting thing, at least for me, is I'm developing an online course, Validation for Physicians. And I wrote it with 2 physicians. Their input was critical, because I can write something gorgeous that I think is great, but if the physicians are not going to take it or be interested, then I've done it for nothing. So they were very integral in helping me shape the curriculum. And I have a pedagogic expert who helped me refine it. And now I'm working on putting it together, and I'm hoping that will be done and ready for beta testing in the summer. Wonderful fun. So that's the creative work I really love. We're going to hopefully be starting 2. When I say worker course, that is our first level of certification. And it takes about 9 months for somebody to become certified in the validation method. So it's a long process, but I think we're going to be starting 2 courses, possibly a third, towards the end of this year, and that's quite exciting.
Have you developed any other courses for people who want to learn the validation method?
Absolutely. Well, we started with the certification courses. Level 1 is the worker. That teaches you how to competently validate individuals. Then level 2 is about validation group work. That is validating people, 4 to 8 disoriented people, using group techniques. Level 3 is presenter, and that's where you start learning how to present validation to others, whether it's a workshop or if you want to become a validation teacher, that's the next step. And to become a teacher, you need to co-teach a level 1 course. And once you become a teacher, if you have done all the courses and worked in validation for 5 years, you can apply for level 5 certification. So it's all, these people are extremely experienced and have integrated it into their bones. We have tons of other trainings because not everybody wants these long, complicated certification courses. So we've got very simple online courses that look at an overview of validation. That's good for pretty much anybody. We've got skill building blocks, which is super for anybody who's working hands-on with people who have different forms of dementia. We've got a special course for activity professionals, family caregivers, because family members are special. It's really harder to validate your mom or your dad or your husband or your wife or your sister because it's a complicated relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So we developed a whole training for families. And we have we've got a special course for first responders, police, fire, paramedic, with publication to go with it, a workbook.
Well, if people want to learn more about you or about any of this and explore taking courses and so on, how do they do that?
Go to our website. Hopefully it's very clear. It's vfvalidation.org, O-R-G. And I'm sure, Michael, you'll put it down somewhere where people can just click the button. And we've really made an effort to provide training at the level that people want it. Because just like in validation, where we go to the needs of the older adult, one of my guiding principles in this company has been, we need to serve the needs of our audience, of our community. And that is everybody in the world. Anybody who has aging parents or grandparents, or meets older people in the community, or works with them in any professional way. Well, validation can be helpful.
Well, and you and I met in an interesting way, and that is that we were introduced by a colleague, Sheldon Lewis at Accessibility, because he said that you were interested in accessibility on websites and so on, and we're glad of that. And that led to this, that we got a chance to really come on and spend an hour talking with you. And I hope that people will reach out and that we are able to help enhance what you're doing by giving you this opportunity to talk about validation and helping us to gain, I hope, a little bit better understanding of things that we can do.
Well, thank you so much for guiding this interview in such a comfortable way.
Well, we try, needless to say. But I would again encourage you who are listening, please reach out and learn about what Vicki is doing and learn about this method, because we will all find it useful to do. I also want to hear from you. I'd love to know what you think about our episode today. Please feel free to email me, Michael H.I. at accessibe.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. And we are also putting this up on YouTube. And we're doing our best to make sure as many people know about it as possible. So you can help by giving us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening or watching this. And especially if you're on Apple and iTunes, please give us a 5-star rating to help people realize how valuable this is and that you like what we're doing. So again, thank you for doing that in advance. Hope to hear from you. And Vicki, I want to thank you one more time for being with us today and helping to show people that in reality, there are things that we can learn to do to help make us more unstoppable than we ever thought we were.
Thank you.